What if I told you the West is done with sanctions and now they're going after ships? Because in 2026, this isn't economic warfare anymore. This is maritime warfare. And the question isn't whether Russia and Iran can sell oil. The question is whether they can keep their tankers afloat long enough to actually deliver it. Hey, today's February 18th, 2026. I'm Justin McShane. Thanks for spending part of your morning with us at Geopolitics Unplugged.com. Here's your deep dive for February 17th, 2026. So, the big story, we're entering into a new phase of global enforcement. For years, the West tried to choke off Russian and Iranian oil exports with sanctions, price caps, blacklists, insurance bans, financial isolation, and it worked on paper. But in reality, the oil kept flowing. Russia still shipped roughly 7 to 8 million barrels per day. Iran climbed back towards 1.5 million barrels per day. So now the West is escalating. And this escalation has a name: tanker seizures. Not sanctions, not paperwork, not press releases, actual physical interdictions, boardings, detentions, confiscations, meaning this is no longer a financial squeeze, it's a high seas takedown operation. So the core question is this: if sanctions couldn't stop the oil, can seizures stop the flow? Or does this just push the world into a hotter naval confrontation? Because here's the truth: sanctions are slow bleed. Seizures are a punch in the face, and punches create retaliation. Why sanctions failed to choke the volume? Sanctions absolutely hurt revenues. They forced discounts. Russia's Ural crude traded at $10 to $20 below Brent, sometimes more. At one point, the spread blew out to $27 per barrel. And that's not small money. That's tens of billions in lost revenue. But here's what sanctions did not do. They did not collapse export volumes because the market adapted. And the adaptation mechanism is the shadow fleet. Now enter the shadow fleet. The shadow fleet is the real enemy of sanctions. It's a floating evasion network. Old ships, fake flags, AIS spoofing, ship-to-ship transfers, ghost cargo manifests, insurance laundering. It's a system built to make oil disappear into the fog and reappear as legitimate product somewhere else. And the numbers are staggering depending upon who you ask. The shadow fleet is somewhere between 600 to 1,400 vessels. And these aren't shiny modern tankers. These are aging hulls. Average age around 19 years compared to the global fleet average of about 14, which means they're riskier, they're more accident prone. And if one of these rust buckets spills crude in a choke point, there's no real insurance, no cleanup backstop, just chaos. So let's talk about how the system works. Picture this: a tanker loads Urals crude at Novorisk and goes dark with a transponder off. AIS spoofed. It disappears from tracking. And then it pops up weeks later off Malaysia, where it does ship-to-ship transfer. Cargo gets blended. Paperwork gets cleaned. Now suddenly it's not Russian oil. It's miscellaneous crude blend. And the final buyer, almost always the same: China. Because China is the shadow fleet's ultimate customer. China is a sponge that absorbs sanctioned barrels. And that's why sanctions don't stop the flow. They just made the flow uglier. Sanctions did one thing really well. Sanctions created discounts. They turned Russian and Iranian oil into cheap oil. And cheap oil is irresistible, especially if you're China. So sanctions didn't stop exports. They created a global underground oil market, a black market discount system. And as long as the discount exists, someone will take that risk. So now we get the 2026 strategy shift. And this is where 2026 becomes different, because in early 2026, the West is shifting from paper enforcement to actual physical enforcement, meaning the West is no longer saying, you're sanctioned. They're saying, we're taking your ship. And that's a completely different world, because if you seize the ship, you don't just punish the regime, you remove the tonnage from circulation. You reduce the fleet capacity. You create logistical panic, and you spike freight premiums. Why seizures are so powerful? A seizure does three things instantly. Number one, it removes the vessel. That tanker is off the board. Number two, it scares the operators. Crew detention, arrest risks, asset forfeiture. And number three, it raises costs across the entire network. Insurance rates spike, charter rates spike, risk premiums explode. And once risk premiums explode, marginal operators quit. And once marginal operators quit, volume begins to fall. That's the play. The seizure wave is already here. This isn't theoretical. We're already seeing seizures ramp up globally. In January 2026, the U.S. boarded and seized a tanker called the Marina in the North Atlantic. That's not a port detention. That's a high seas sporting operation, meaning the U.S. is now willing to enforce sanctions with warships. Europe is also stepping in. French forces intercepted vessels in the Mediterranean. Italy detained tankers with falsified documentation. And India seized multiple tankers linked to Iran's shadow fleet activity. That's a big deal because India is not traditionally a sanctions enforcer. India is usually a buyer. So if India is seizing tankers, that signals coalition building. That signals the West is building a maritime enforcement web. Why is this a market event? Let me be very blunt. Tanker seizures are bullish oil because seizures tighten supply, not by reducing reserves, not by reducing production, but by reducing delivery capability. This is not about geology. This is about logistics, and logistics is what sets prices in the short run. If the shadow fleet gets squeezed, Russian barrels get stuck. Iranian barrels get stuck. Cargoes float offshore unsold, and global supply tightens. That pushes Brent towards $80 or $90, maybe higher, especially if seizures begin to scale. The shadow fleet is already showing stress. In January 2026, Russian exports dipped towards 7.2 million barrels per day. Iran dipped towards 1.2 million barrels per day, not because they ran out of oil, but because enforcement started biting. And here's what matters. Even a small dip is psychologically massive because the oil market is a confidence machine. If traders believe enforcement is escalating, the price risk raises immediately. Sanctions versus seizures, the real comparison. Let's break it down like a trader. Sanctions are scalable. They're easy to implement. You can blacklist 500 ships just with a PDF. But sanctions deepen on compliance, meaning they work only if the market obeys. And the shadow fleet proved the market won't obey. Seizures are different. Seizures are not scalable, at least not easily. You can't seize 500 ships without a major naval coalition. But seizures deliver instant impact. Sanctions are passive. Seizures are kinetic. Sanctions are bureaucracy. Seizures are fear. The hybrid model is the real weapon. And this is where the West is going. Hybrid enforcement. Sanctions create the legal hooks, the warrants, the blacklists, the justification. Then seizures enforce them physically. This is how sanctions become real. And the EU is already moving in this direction. The proposed 20th EU sanction package expands service bans, port restrictions, and adds more shadow fleet vessels to the list. This is basically a tightening noose. Sanctions shrink the legal operating space. Seizures punish anyone who tries to operate anyway. That combination is lethal. But here's the danger. Seizures are escalatory. Russia is already calling them piracy, and Russia is threatening naval escorts. Now imagine the scenario. A Western warship approaches a tanker, a Russian escort appears, weapons systems are active, radar locked, one mistake, one miscommunication, one aggressive maneuver, and suddenly sanctions enforcement becomes a naval confrontation. This is why the Strait of Hormuz matters. This is why the Red Sea matters. This is why the Baltic approaches matter. These choke points are the fuse. And Iran is watching closely because Iran has its own playbook. If the U.S. expands seizures into IRGC-linked networks, Iran will retaliate. Iran has already seized tankers before. Iran has already harassed shipping in the Hormuz. Iran has already signaled it can turn that strait into hell. And the Strait of Hormuz is not optional. A massive portion of global oil exports transit through that corridor. So the risk is simple. If seizures expand aggressively, Iran escalates Hormuz, and the world gets an oil shock. The RIC axis is the real target. Now, here's the part most people miss. This isn't only about Russia. This isn't only about Iran. This is about the RIC axis. Russia, Iran, China. Because China is the buyer. Russia is the supplier. Iran is the proxy financing machine. And the shadow fleet is the artery that connects them. So seizures are not just enforcement. They're geopolitical wedge strategy. And the U.S. is trying to fracture the axis, trying to peel India away, trying to isolate China, trying to break the discount oil pipeline feeding Beijing. And China is responding. China has already increased imports of Russian crude towards 2 million barrels per day. That's record territory, meaning China is absorbing the barrels. India is reducing. China is acting like the buyer of last resort, which means that Beijing is basically underwriting Russia's war economy. And that makes shadow fleet enforcement even more explosive because if China feels threatened, China will respond economically and maybe militarily through proxies. The future is simple. If the West stays relentless, seizures could create a real volume choke. Russian exports could fall below 7 million barrels per day. Iran could fall below 1 million barrels per day. And if that happens, oil prices move higher. Global inflation moves higher. And the energy becomes a political weapon again. But if the West hesitates, if allies fracture, if enforcement slows, the shadow fleet adapts because the shadow fleet isn't really a fleet, it's a business model. It will reflag, it will reroute, and it will evolve. The final verdict. Sanctions alone are not enough. Seizures alone are too dangerous. But sanctions plus seizures, that's a new kind of warfare. Economic warfare with kinetic enforcement. And that's the defining maritime story for 2026 because the West is no longer trying to punish the seller. They're trying to break the delivery system. And if they succeed, Russia and Iran lose more than money. They lose capability. So here's the real question I have for you before I leave you. If tanker seizures escalate into the Strait of Hormuz or the English Channel, do we get an oil shock or do we get a full-blown naval conflict? Drop your answers in the comments because this is the kind of story that doesn't stay economic for very long. And that's your deep dive for today. You can read the full, long, rapid read at geopoliticsunplugged.com. 16,000 plus people read it every morning, and you should too. We do this every morning. Click subscribe to stay in the know. See you tomorrow morning, and cheers.